Most people believe a blackout is an electricity problem. It is not. It is a systems problem. And electricity is just the switch that holds all the other systems together. When the power goes out, the average American household has approximately 8 hours before the first real consequences begin. Not days, hours. The food in the refrigerator starts its countdown. The electric pump that draws water from the well goes silent. The garage door becomes a wall. The thermostat calls for heat or cooling and nothing answers. The alarm panel, the carbon monoxide detector with a dead backup battery, the router that connects the house to the outside world, all of them dependent on the same single source that just disappeared. What this video is about is not electricity. It is about what was working before electricity existed and what still works today when the grid fails. There are 10 systems, habits, and physical assets that your home depends on more than you may realize. And most of them have nothing to do with a power outlet. Before we get into them, a quick note for everyone watching from a television right now. And we know many of you are. If this channel has been useful to your family, subscribing and sharing this video is the single best way to help it grow, so we can keep making content like this. It takes 1 second and costs nothing. Now let us get into it. Number 10 is natural ventilation, and it used to be the only ventilation that existed. Before forced air systems, before electric fans, before central air conditioning became the default assumption in American home construction, entire civilizations built their homes around the movement of air. Ancient Roman homes had open atriums designed to pull cool air upward through the structure. Farmhouses in the American South were built with wide wraparound porches, high ceilings, and cross-ventilating window placement specifically engineered to move hot air out and draw cooler air in from shaded ground level. Indigenous longhouses in the Northeast used smoke holes and lateral openings to create convective airflow without a single mechanical component. When the power goes out in summer, especially during a heat event, the ability to understand and work with natural ventilation is not a comfort consideration. It is a safety consideration. The 1995 Chicago heat wave, a well-documented public health disaster, killed more than 700 people over 5 days. The majority of victims were found in homes where heat had built up to dangerous levels without any way to escape. Many of those residents had air conditioners they could no longer run. What they lacked was the knowledge of how to use the architecture of their own home to move air without power. The principle is simple. Cool air is heavier and sinks. Warm air is lighter and rises. Open low windows on the shaded windward side of the house and open high windows or attic vents on the opposite side, and you create a draft. Hot air exits at the top. Cooler air enters at the bottom. No electricity, no motor, no wiring, just physics, working exactly the way it has always worked, and the way builders understood before the electrical grid made them lazy. Most modern American homes are not designed for this. The windows are sealed units. The layouts are built around HVAC, not airflow. When the power disappears, those homes become sealed boxes and interior temperature can climb several degrees per hour in direct sun. Knowing where your home's natural airflow paths are and having the ability to open them is the first thing most people never test before a crisis begins. Number 9 is stored water, and the pressure tank in your home is smaller than you think. In the years before rural electrification, which in many parts of the United States did not arrive until the 1940s, and in some parts of Appalachia not until the late 1960s, the most critical feature of any piece of land was its proximity to water. Homesteaders did not shop for kitchens. They located their homes based on where a spring, a well, or a reliable creek sat in relation to the structure. Water was the organizing principle of the property. Everything else was secondary. The electric submersible pump changed that relationship permanently. It made water access feel automatic. You press a handle. Water appears. The effort is hidden behind a motor 60 or 100 feet underground. When power fails, that motor stops. And here is the detail most families with private wells do not know. The pressure tank that holds water and delivers it to your faucets typically contains between 5 and 20 gallons of usable water. That is not a day's supply for a family of 4. The CDC recommends 1 gallon per person per day as an absolute minimum for drinking and sanitation. A family of 4 burns through that pressure reserve in a matter of hours, and then the faucet runs dry. Residents on municipal systems are not necessarily safer. Water treatment plants and pumping stations require continuous electrical power to operate. During extended outages, many cities issue boil water notices within 24 to 48 hours as pump pressure drops and contamination risk increases. During the 2022 Jackson, Mississippi water crisis, triggered by power failures at pumping stations during flooding, more than 150,000 residents spent weeks without reliable water service, despite being connected to a public utility. The electricity disappeared. The water followed it out the door. Stored water is the thing most households chronically underprepare, not because people do not know they need it, but because they underestimate how fast they use it and how quickly a grid dependency they never questioned can disappear entirely. Number 8 is a non-electric cooking method, and it predates civilization itself. Every emergency supply of canned goods, every shelf-stable item stacked in a pantry becomes almost irrelevant without a way to cook. This is the gap most families discover on day 2 of a blackout, not day 1. The first day, people eat what is in the refrigerator before it spoils. The second day, they reach for the canned goods, the dried beans, the pasta. And they discover the electric range does nothing, and the microwave is now a decorative box. Cooking with fire is the oldest human technology. For most of recorded history, the hearth was not a decorative feature of the home. It was the center of daily life. Cooking, heating, and light came from the same source. The separation of those functions is an artifact of modern infrastructure, not of human capability. A camp stove with spare propane canisters is not a survivalist luxury. A standard 1-pound propane canister supports approximately 2 hours of high-heat cooking. 3 or 4 of them, stored safely in a garage or shed, provide the ability to cook hot meals across a week-long outage. A cast iron skillet, which holds heat uniformly, works on open flame, and requires no maintenance, becomes the most functional piece of cookware in the house the moment the electric range goes silent. In communities across rural Appalachia, in parts of the Mississippi Delta, and in mountain towns in the Rockies that lose power several times each year, this is not an emergency plan. It is simply how people eat when the grid is unreliable. They have the equipment, they have the fuel, they have the habit. For everyone else, the stove going dark is a crisis they were not prepared for. Number 7 is light management, and it is older than glass. When Thomas Edison's Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan switched on in September 1882, it delivered electricity to 85 customers across roughly 1 square mile. That was the beginning of the end for open-flame home lighting in cities. But for the vast majority of Americans, dependence on candles, oil lamps, and natural light extended well past the turn of the century. For rural communities reached last by rural electrification, it extended into the middle of the 20th century entirely. In colonial America, a candle from a chandler cost roughly 6 cents, close to $2 in modern terms, and burned for approximately 6 hours. A family could not leave candles burning throughout the house the way modern families leave lights on. They gathered. They worked around a single light source. They adjusted the household schedule to daylight because artificial light after dark was expensive and finite. The practical risk today is different. The National Fire Protection Association cites candles as a leading cause of residential fire during power outages, typically when people who have no habit with open flame use them improperly. A candle near curtains, knocked over by a child or a pet, or left burning overnight is a structure fire risk that is almost entirely avoidable with better preparation. Battery-powered LED lanterns, solar charging lanterns that recharge in a window, and hands-free LED headlamps have replaced candles as the safe standard for outage lighting. The problem is not that these products do not exist. It is that families do not own them before the outage. When the power fails after dark and the house goes black, people drain the only device that connects them to the outside world, the phone, using it as a flashlight. Then they find themselves in the dark with a candle and no experience managing one. Number 6 is cash on hand, and a grid-down economy works exactly the way a pre-digital economy did. When power goes out across a region, the card readers at every store in the affected area go dark simultaneously. The ATMs on bank exteriors become unusable. The tap-to-pay feature on a phone does nothing. Every digital transaction pathway closes at once because all of them share the same underlying dependency: electricity and a live network connection. During Hurricane Harvey in Texas in August 2017, residents across the Houston metro area reported that gas stations with generators could only accept cash. Grocery stores with partial backup power could ring purchases but not process cards because their network terminals had lost connectivity. The people who had cash moved. The people who depended only on digital transactions waited or went without. Cash requires no battery, no network, no satellite signal, no verification. It works in the dark. It works after days without power. The Federal Reserve has consistently noted that cash remains legal tender regardless of infrastructure conditions. A technical way of saying it works when nothing else does. Small bills in a secure location represent complete purchasing independence from the grid, and that independence has immediate value the moment an outage begins. Number 5 is passive temperature management, and buildings were designed for it for thousands of years before HVAC existed. The adobe structures of Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico have been continuously inhabited for more than 1,000 years. They require no forced air heat and no electric cooling to remain livable across winters that drop below zero and summers that climb past 90 degrees. The thick walls, sometimes 2 feet of compressed earth, absorb heat slowly during the day and release it slowly at night. Interior temperatures stay far more stable than any thin-walled modern structure. It is not a cultural artifact. It is thermal physics, and it works whether or not the power is on. Modern American homes, almost uniformly built on wood frame construction with minimal thermal mass, provide essentially no passive temperature buffering. When the HVAC shuts off, the interior temperature begins drifting toward the outdoor temperature within hours. In winter, this creates pipe risk before it creates occupant discomfort. In summer, it creates danger for elderly family members and young children before most adults notice a problem. The compensating behaviors are the same ones homes in the pre-electric era used by default: closing interior doors to concentrate warmth, using heavy curtains to block heat gain in summer or reduce heat loss in winter, gathering household members to one room rather than trying to condition the entire structure. After the 1995 Chicago heatwave, epidemiologists found that residents who closed their homes during the hottest afternoon hours and opened windows at night, the pattern used before air conditioning existed, survived at significantly higher rates than those who lost mechanical cooling with no backup strategy at all. Under pressure, untested behaviors fail. Number 4 is manual tools, and the category is broader than most people expect. The manual can opener is the most frequently cited preparedness gap in post-disaster household surveys. It sounds almost embarrassing to mention. Yet, the FEMA and the American Red Cross include it consistently in preparedness checklists because it is the item households most routinely fail to own. The electric version sits on the counter as a standard appliance. The manual version, which requires no battery and no motor, has become so uncommon that many households do not have one at all. But manual tools extend far beyond the kitchen. The ability to read a paper map when the GPS app has no signal and the phone is at 4%. The ability to shut off a gas line with a simple wrench when the automated emergency line is overwhelmed. The ability to charge a device with a hand crank charger when the nearest functional outlet is miles away. The ability to fill a prescription using a written paper record when the pharmacy's electronic system is offline. Each of these is a manual capability that existed before the electrical equivalent was invented, and each of them remains fully functional in a grid-down environment. After Hurricane Ian made landfall near Fort Myers, Florida in September 2022, hundreds of residents across coastal Lee County were trapped in damaged structures with no power and no cell service for the first 24 hours. The people who could communicate their location by non-electronic means were found sooner. Communication without electronics is a manual skill. Navigation without GPS is a manual skill. First aid without a connected device is a manual skill. The outage revealed, as it always does, which skills had been retained and which had been outsourced entirely to the grid. Number 3 is community knowledge, and this is the one the preparedness industry almost never talks about. Every major post-disaster study conducted in the past 4 decades arrives at the same finding. The single most reliable predictor of survival and recovery following a major disruption is not the depth of individual supplies. It is the density of social connection within a physical community. After Hurricane Katrina made landfall near New Orleans in August 2005, researchers studying which neighborhoods recovered fastest found the answer was not correlated most strongly with income, housing quality, or even flood depth. It was correlated with pre-existing social cohesion, whether neighbors knew each other by name, whether there was an informal communication network, whether people had any habit of checking on one another under difficult conditions. In several blocks of the lower Ninth Ward, residents who had known their neighbors for years coordinated informal rescues in the hours before official help arrived, because they knew which houses held elderly residents who could not swim, who could not escape by water. In newer developments where people did not know their neighbors, even residents with resources and supplies suffered from information isolation. They did not know that 3 houses away, someone had a boat. They did not know because they had never talked. This is not a product. It cannot be ordered. It is a relationship built in ordinary, unhurried time. A conversation with the neighbor you have been nodding at for years. The act of learning which houses in your area contain people who may need help when infrastructure fails. That knowledge, shared across a block, has saved more lives than every individual preparedness kit combined. Number 2 is a non-electric communication plan, because information is what every other preparation depends on. During extended outages, the information landscape degrades in a predictable sequence. First, the Wi-Fi router loses power. Then mobile data slows as cell towers become congested with traffic from everyone suddenly trying to reach the same networks at the same time. Within 12 to 24 hours, many towers begin running on backup battery or generator fuel, and those that run out of fuel go silent. In areas affected by major weather events, EMS and utility emergency lines become overwhelmed. Information about road conditions, shelter locations, water availability, power restoration timelines becomes scarce exactly when it is most needed. A battery-powered or hand-crank NOAA weather radio, which receives broadcasts on dedicated emergency frequencies that continue functioning during grid failures, provides access to official emergency information when every other digital channel is unavailable. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration maintains this network specifically for scenarios in which standard communication infrastructure has failed. A radio that costs under $30 can receive shelter-in-place advisories, water safety warnings, evacuation routes, and restoration timelines from local emergency management, all without a cell tower, a router, or a working outlet. A pre-arranged out-of-state contact, a family member or friend in a different region, serves as a communication hub when local networks are saturated. During localized disasters, long-distance calls and texts often go through when local calls cannot, because they route through different network nodes that are not handling the same spike in local traffic. This is why emergency communication plans typically designate an out-of-area contact point as the person everyone checks in with, so that family members in different locations can confirm each other's safety without tying up overwhelmed local infrastructure. During Hurricane Beryl in July 2024, which left more than 2 million Houston area customers without power, some for more than 2 weeks, the communication breakdown was as disorienting as the physical outage itself. The families with a NOAA radio and a pre-agreed check-in protocol navigated it with far less confusion than those who had depended entirely on apps that had nothing to connect to. Number 1 is the written household emergency plan. And it is the item that makes every other item on this list actually work. A written household emergency plan is not a document about catastrophe. It is a practical agreement made in advance, during calm, about decisions that will need to be made under pressure. Where does the family meet if the house becomes uninhabitable? Who calls whom? In what order? If communication is disrupted? What is the protocol if a family member is at school or at work when the crisis begins? Where are the important documents? Insurance, identification, medical records. And are they accessible without power? Who in the household knows how to turn off the gas at the main valve and where that valve is located? FEMA's National Household Survey consistently finds that roughly half of American households have no emergency plan at all. Not a basic one, not a partial one. The same data shows only about a third of Americans have practiced their plan even once in the previous year. That is not a supply problem. A plan costs nothing to create. It requires no purchase, no subscription, no hardware. It requires time, a piece of paper, and a conversation. What it provides is pre-committed decision-making. In a genuine emergency, the cognitive load on every adult in the household becomes enormous. Decisions that would normally take seconds take minutes. Information that should be recalled is missing. People operate from fear and impulse rather than from pre-established agreement. A written plan replaces panic-driven improvisation with choices that were already made calmly, by people who were not under pressure when they made them. Every item on this list, the ventilation, the stored water, the cooking capability, the light sources, the cash, the thermal management, the manual tools, the community relationships, the communication plan, is more useful when there is a plan that specifies who does what, where things are located, how decisions get made, and when a situation crosses from manageable to one that requires leaving. The plan is the architecture inside which every other preparation has meaning. It is the one item with no electricity requirement, no shelf life, and no purchase price. The grid is not getting more reliable. The U.S. Census Bureau's 2023 American Housing Survey found that 1 in 4 American households, roughly 33.9 million homes, lost power at least once that year. Nearly 70% experienced an outage lasting 6 hours or longer. Major outage events have tripled in frequency since 2003. The infrastructure is aging, the weather is intensifying, and demand is rising. Preparedness is not panic. Panic is what happens when preparation never occurred. The goal is not to live in fear. The goal is to give your family options when everyone else has run out of them. This channel will keep building on that foundation, and the next episode addresses the question that follows directly from everything covered here. If you have the ability to cook without the grid, if you have the plan and the manual tools and the stored water, what specifically should be in your long-term pantry? How long those items actually last under real storage conditions? And what the most common beginner mistakes are that quietly ruin months of careful preparation in a single storage error. That episode is next.